In 1994, a man named Ehrlichman gave an interview to journalist Dan Baum. Ehrlichman was Richard Nixon's domestic policy chief, one of the architects of the modern war on drugs. In this interview, he said, and I'm going to read this carefully because every word matters. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. That quote sat unpublished for 22 years. Ehrlichman died in 1999. Baum finally published it in Harper's Magazine in 2016. The war on drugs, the policy that has imprisoned millions, consumed trillions of dollars, and shaped the last 50 years of American society, began, by the admission of one of its founders, as a lie designed to target political enemies. Everything that follows flows from that. To understand how consequential this is, you need to understand the scale of what the war on drugs became. Since Nixon officially declared it in 1971, the United States has spent over $1 trillion on drug enforcement. That is not a typo. $1 trillion on police, prosecutors, prisons, interdiction, and international operations across more than 50 years. Today, the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate of any country on Earth. Around 2 million people are currently imprisoned in America. Roughly 20% of them are their drug offenses. That's 400,000 human beings behind bars, right now, for conduct that is legal in several U.S. states and fully decriminalized in much of the developed world. Drug overdose deaths, meanwhile, have increased every decade since the war on drugs began. In 1971, approximately 5,000 Americans died of drug overdoses annually. In 2023, that number exceeded 7,000 by any measurable outcome. Drug use rates, overdose deaths, addiction prevalence, drug availability. The war on drugs has failed completely. Drugs are cheaper, more potent, and more available today than they were when the war began. If this were a business, it would have been shut down in year 5. It has been running for 53. The question worth asking, the one most people never ask, is, what if failure was never the point? The entire premise of the war on drugs rests on a specific model of addiction. That model says, drugs are inherently chemically enslaving. One hit of crack cocaine and you're hooked. The substance hijacks your brain and removes your ability to choose. Therefore, the correct response is to remove the substance, criminalize it, intercept it, imprison those who use it. That model is wrong, not controversial, wrong. And the scientific community has known it for decades. The most famous challenge to it came from an unexpected place: the Vietnam War. Between 1966 and 1971, approximately 35% per soldier of U.S. soldiers ingested heroin. Not occasionally. The military was terrified. Back home, politicians prepared for a catastrophic wave of returning addicts that would overwhelm American society. It didn't happen. Researcher Lee Robbins followed those veterans home and found that approximately 95% of the heroin users simply stopped, without treatment, without rehab, without intervention. They came home, resumed their lives, and quit. This finding was so incompatible with the official addiction model that it was largely ignored for decades. Psychologist Bruce Alexander ran a different experiment in the 1970s called Rat Park. Standard addiction research put rats alone in small cages with 2 water bottles, one plain, one laced with morphine. The rats consistently chose the drug water, used compulsively, and often died. This became gospel proof that drugs were inherently addictive. Alexander changed one variable. He gave the rats a good life. Large enclosures, other rats, stimulation, food, play. In Rat Park, the rats with access to drug water barely used it. They preferred living. The conclusion, uncomfortable for a policy built on criminalization, was that addiction is not primarily a chemical phenomenon. It is primarily a response to environment, trauma, and disconnection. People do not use drugs compulsively because the drugs are there. They use them compulsively because something in their life is unbearable, and the drugs temporarily make it bearable. Criminalization, which destroys jobs, removes housing, separates families, and creates permanent social stigma, does not address that underlying pain. It manufactures more of it. Now back to Ehrlichman's confession, because it demands a question. Is there actually evidence that the war on drugs was enforced with racial targeting, or is that a historical claim that didn't translate into practice? The data, unambiguous. Black and white Americans use marijuana at essentially the same rates. Study after study, decade after decade, confirms this. The American Civil Liberties Union analyzed FBI arrest data across multiple years and found that Black Americans are 3.73 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white Americans, despite essentially identical usage rates. For cocaine, usage rates between Black and white Americans are comparable. The sentence for crack cocaine, historically more prevalent in Black communities, was, until 2010, 100 times more severe than the sentence for powder cocaine. Identical drug, chemically. 100 to 1 sentencing disparity. A Black person convicted of a drug offense serve, on average, nearly as much time in prison as a white person convicted of a violent offense. These allegations, these are Department of Justice statistics. The war on drugs did not accidentally fall harder on Black communities. It was, by the admission of its architect, designed to. 50 years of enforcement data confirms that design was faithfully implemented. In 2001, Portugal did something no other country had done. Facing a catastrophic heroin epidemic, one of the worst in Europe, with 1% of its entire population addicted to heroin, they decriminalized the personal possession and use of all drugs. Not legalized, decriminalized. Possession remained an administrative offense, not a criminal one. Users caught with drugs were sent before dissuasion commissions, panels of social workers, lawyers, and medical professionals who assessed their situation and referred them to treatment if needed. The money previously spent on arresting, prosecuting, and imprisoning drug users was redirected to treatment, housing, and employment programs. Here, what happened? Drug-related HIV infections, which had accounted for over 50% of new HIV cases in Portugal, fell by over 95%. Drug-related deaths dropped dramatically. Drug use among teen and 24-year-olds, the highest risk group, decreased. The prison population fell, and overall drug use in Portugal remained below the European average. 20 years later, the data holds. Portugal did not become a drug tourism haven. Society did not collapse. What happened instead was that people who had been trapped in cycles of addiction, criminalization, and social exclusion were reached by services that could actually help them. The comparison to the United States is stark. Same 50-year time frame, Portugal spent its resources on health. The US spent its resources on punishment. The outcomes are not comparable. Let me steelman the other side, because missing it entirely would be intellectually dishonest. Decriminalization is not without complications. Portugal's model worked within a specific cultural and social context. Strong family networks, a relatively small and homogeneous population, and pre-existing community infrastructure that could absorb the redirect of resources. Scaling that to a country of 330 million with profoundly different regional contexts is genuinely complex. There is also a legitimate argument that certain substances, fentanyl, methamphetamine, present risks severe enough that some enforcement framework is appropriate, particularly for supply-side operations. Full legalization of all drugs is a distinct and more contested position from decriminalization of personal use, and some communities, particularly those most damaged by the crack epidemic, have nuanced and conflicted feelings about decriminalization that are not reducible to ignorance of the data. Those feelings deserve respect and honest engagement. The argument here is not that drug policy is simple. It is that a policy designed from the start around political targeting, enforced along demonstrably racial lines, and validated by zero positive outcomes over 50 years does not deserve the deference it has received. The burden of proof should be on those defending the status quo, not those questioning it. $1 trillion. 400,000 people in prison today. 107,000 overdose deaths last year, 53 years. And at the beginning of all of it, a political operative sitting in a room, admitting on the record that they knew they were lying, that the target was never the drugs, it was the people. That is not ancient history. It is the architecture that still stands. The mandatory minimums are still on the books. The sentencing disparities, though reduced, still exist. The communities fractured by mass incarceration are still fractured. Portugal showed one path. Other countries, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Canada, have shown variations of it. The outcomes are consistent. Treat addiction as a health crisis, not a moral failing. Redirect resources from punishment to support. Watch the numbers improve. The science on addiction has been clear for 40 years. The historical record has been clear since 2016. The international evidence has been accumulating for 2 decades. The war on drugs was never about protecting people from drugs. The question now is whether we're